Hello, I'm Dr. Jen Martin. I founded and lead the University of Melbourne Science Communication Teaching Program, and I'm so excited to be talking with you today about an introduction to science communication. There are so many reasons why you might want to improve your communication of your science. Perhaps you want to broaden the audiences that you're connecting with, or perhaps you're thinking about the impact of your work. Whatever the reason, I always come back to so much of the work that we do as scientists is publicly funded, so I reckon the public should be able to access what we do and understand what it means. So the first point that you need to think about always is your goal. What is your purpose of communicating about your work? What would a successful outcome look like? What are you trying to achieve? And once you have your goal clearly in mind, you can start to think about your audience. Now, we've all heard the science communication maxim of know your audience. And yes, you should do your best to know who they are and what's going to be relevant to them. But first you have to work out who is the target audience. And of course, that depends on what your goal is. Who is it that you're trying to connect with? Who is it that you're trying to influence so that you can work towards your goal? Once you're clear on what your goal is and who your audience is, next you need to think about your message. How are you going to craft a message that is relevant to this audience? A message that's going to resonate with them. And it may be that the message that you're used to saying or writing about your work is quite different to the message that's going to resonate and make sense to this audience. So we have to think so much about our messages and how we tell them. So once you're clear on what your goal is, who the audience is that you want to speak with, and how you're going to craft a message about your work that's going to bring them on board with what you're trying to do, the next thing to think about is what platform or communication channel is going to be right for you. Perhaps you need to give a talk. Perhaps you need to write a blog article or a piece in The Conversation. Perhaps you need to do a whole lot of work on social media. There are so many different platforms available to us, and you're going to have to think carefully about the right platform to share your message with this audience. And then when we're thinking about a message, there's a few other things to think about. Firstly, I really want you to think about starting with a hook. Whether you're writing, whether you're speaking, the very first words you use are so important, because that's how you convince a potentially busy, time-poor, quite distracted audience that they should pay attention to you. They should listen, they should read your words, they should give you some of their time. So the hook could be a little anecdote, maybe it could be some striking statistic, it could be an amazing picture if that works for the platform you're using, but something so that from that very first moment your audience is convinced this is worth my time. And the other thing that I think is just so important for all of us is to think about the language that we use. One of the key goals of science communication is being inclusive, is recognising the privilege that we have as people who've been trained in science. And sure, we can use a whole lot of technical language when we're speaking with one another. That's fine, it's like a shortcut. But if we're trying to communicate with people who haven't had that privilege of all those years of education, it's so important that we use language that's accessible, because we want people to understand what are the questions we're asking, what are the problems that we're trying to solve, why do they matter? And if we use language that's inclusive, we can bring a whole lot more people into the world of what we're doing and why we want them to care about it. So I think the most important thing to always start with is what's your goal? What's the purpose of you communicating about your work? What are you trying to achieve? Always come back to your why. Once you're clear on your goal, think about the audience that you need to connect with and communicate with. Make sure you know who they are and how you're going to make your work relevant for them. And part of that is thinking about a really good hook to start with that's going to convince them this is relevant to them, this is going to be interesting to them. Think very carefully about the language that you use. Make sure you're not falling into the habit of using technical words that this audience is not going to understand. And finally, always think about how you can use a story to have your audience on the edge of their seat wanting to know what happens next.